people who don't, because this is how I feel about my job. Because unlike other journalists, we get to do something extra special here at Rebel News. Because we don't just get to report on the bonfire of civil liberties that is burning every single day, but sometimes we get to throw a bucket of water on that bonfire, and it might not put the whole thing out, might only put out a little part. But that's what we get to do. So we don't just get to report on the catastrophe, we actually get to be involved in offering a solution, be it through a partnership with the Democracy Fund, or helping people get involved with petitions or activism, or, as the left says, raising awareness, which is when we embarrass people by hiring billboard trucks. And sometimes it's just moral support. When you're bringing a story to the world, like was the case with in the early days of what was happening in the Whistle Stop, it was, you had this one tiny business owner in this one tiny little place in the middle of Nowheresville, Alberta. But the whole world was watching once we started coming there to show everybody that this man is standing up. It's not just for him, it's for you too. And so all that is to say, Chris Scott, the owner of the Whistle Stop Café from beautiful Mirror, Alberta, population 520-ish, I think, these days. He was one of the early resistors of the lockdown. He opened his business in defiance of the lockdown. Ultimately, it led to his arrest and incarceration for 3 days, a gag order where he had to publicly denounce himself, engage in a struggle session against himself before he could give his honest viewpoint on lockdowns, vaccines, whatever. He had his property seized, which resulted in collective punishment for the entire community, because he's the only gas station in town. He's the only convenience store in town, the only campsite in town. There was one other restaurant in town, although it didn't do quite as well as his. And so the whole community was punished by the government because he stood up, but everybody rallied around him, people from all over the world. And I spent, he says, a week there, but I probably spent a month there. I think it's all probably a blur to him. But anyways, he tells the story of not us here at Rebel News, but how our involvement in what he was trying to do helped him stand up to the government, because we became the vehicle for other people to help him too. So let's roll this. It was, I'm not going to lie, I was a little bit like, what's the right word? Verklempt. I was sitting sort of like off to the side in the the NCI. So that's the National Citizens Inquiry. And this is it's the citizen-led inquiry into Canada's COVID response. And so I was sitting off to the side, sort of like to what would be, as you're looking, like Chris's right, as he mentioned this. And you forget when you're doing these stories, because it's like you go, you do the story, you try to help how you can, and then you sort of package it up and you move on to the next catastrophe. And you don't realize the impact that you're making when you're doing it until you stop and take a chance to look back. But you're still just moving on to the next thing and trying to help the next person in front of you, that you never really take those minutes to look back. And I was forced to take a minute to look back as Chris was talking here. It's about 2 minutes, but anyways, I think all of our journalists should watch this, because it fills up your moral tank to keep fighting and keep grinding out there, helping people.
You're standing up for yourself, and I admire what you're trying to do, but you've already made your point, and you should just close and follow the rules, because you cannot win against the government.
So I just want to make sure that I'm clear. This is the chief of police?
Yeah, chief of police.
And so it would be an RCMP officer.
Right.
And so the officer actually supports ethically what you're doing, but is communicating to you that as a citizen of Alberta, you don't have a chance of standing up against the government to basically have a right to protest.
That's right. And, the ironic thing is he was right. A citizen cannot win against the government. I was put in a position where to fight the government and to stand up for my rights, and, after realizing what was happening, the rights of people around me, where the outlook is grim. I mean, you retain a lawyer in this province for something like this, and they want $25,000 from you up front before they even do anything. It costs $10,000 to prepare a piece of paper. And somebody like me, there is no way, I don't have not a snowball's chance in hell that I could stand up and do that on my own. But something amazing happened. A lady by the name of Sheila showed up at the Whistle Stop Café, and she's a reporter for Rebel News. And they had a program at the time called Fight the Fines, and they were crowdfunding so that people like me could actually stand up against the government. So with their help, I went from a 100% assured loss to, hey, you know what? We actually have a chance to do something now. Thousands of people, probably millions of people from all over Canada chipped in, and they stood up, and they stood with people like me who were trying to stand up against the government. And all of a sudden, that truth that Sergeant Bruce Holliday had said to me, that you can't win against the government, that truth changed to, you can't win against the government, but we can win against the government. If we stand together and start speaking some truth, and we unify around a truth and move towards doing what's right, we can actually win against the government, because that's the one thing that stands the test of time, is truth. And the truth is that what was done to us was wrong. The bureaucracy that did what they did to us did it in error. For whatever reason, it doesn't matter why they did it, but it was an incorrect path. And we're seeing that now. I mean, we've heard testimony from everybody from Lieutenant Colonel.
Well,
There's another clip
Sheila,
there, too.
first of all,
Sorry.
your
There's
reporting was phenomenal on that. I see you're having a verklempt moment, and
yeah, I'm
and
fine.
And we did reach out. We did help so many people. And I keep going back to the fact that we've spoken about this in the past, that if you think anyone had a bailiwick to put on their Superman tights and fight for these people who are having their rights trampled upon, it would be the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And yet they were AWOL. No, that's not quite right. They weren't AWOL, folks. They were obsessed. It was almost like a fetish to get prisoners, including violent prisoners, out of jail cells so that we could maintain social distancing etiquette. Isn't that amazing, Sheila? Do you feel that we're really living in the bizarro Superman world, up is down, good is bad, etc.?
Yeah. It was just bizarre, actually. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association, they showed up late to the game. Now they're like involved in as much as they possibly can.
Oh.
But this was their wheelhouse.
Yes.
And they were absent. So out of the ether, the Democracy Fund is created and becomes Canada's largest civil liberties charity that focuses on civil liberties litigation and education. And there's a reason for that, is because, as Chris says, there were people who wanted to help somebody like Chris, but they didn't know how. They didn't know how to help him. They didn't know how to get him the help that he needed. And so what we did at Rebel News, and we are taking the credit for it, but we shouldn't be, because it is all the people who donated to him and donated to the Democracy Fund to help not just Chris, but people like him. We just became sort of the connecting piece so that you knew about what Chris was doing. But really, the full credit should go to everybody who donated to the Democracy Fund to fund Chris's fight against the government. And it's still ongoing. He's still at trial for standing up against the government, even though the regulations are gone, the pandemic is gone, if it were ever even here in the first place. But he's still fighting the government. And, it's funny, because this is the same government that said, oh, we have to offer amnesty and pardons to anybody who is ever convicted of a marijuana offense. Okay, I'll hear that argument. But why aren't we extending that same sort of amnesty to the people who all they did was open their restaurant, serve some burgers, and nobody ever got sick?
But you know what, Sheila? You're right. The pandemic is gone. But let the likes of Chris Scott in Alberta and Adam Skelly in Toronto of Adamson's Barbecue, let them stand as a cautionary tale that the next time there's some new variant of the coronavirus, or maybe monkeypox will come back in vogue, or maybe in the years ahead, who knows, we'll have a climate crisis emergency shutdown of the economy. That's actually being proposed. I'm not making this up, folks. Let's
completely.
have everybody open up. Not just ones and twos, but everybody. They can't throw every single business person and restaurateur in jail, Sheila Gunn-Reid. That's what we need to see. We have to take a stand against an oppressive state. We need that fantastic scene in Spartacus, remember? Who is Spartacus, says the Roman centurion. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. That's what we need. We can't allow the state to shut us down like they did. And Chris Scott and Adam Skelly and others showed the way. What we need is a mass acceptance of this, Sheila, that we're not going to take any kind of crap like that ever again. Let's make sure that 2020, 2021, and 2022 were anomalies and that this will never be repeated again.
One more a clip from Chris Scott, because it's not just the government. It was also the mainstream media. They were really the enforcers of the government. They were the ones saying, like signal boosting, all this stuff about, like how dangerous COVID was. There's not a single COVID case associated with the Whistle Stop or any of their protests, which were massive and ongoing. But every day, the rhetoric in the mainstream media reinforced what the government wanted to do to people. They really amplified the fear that drove the compliance, but also drove the attacks on people like Chris. In normal times, you would be like, okay, well, he wants to open, but I'm scared of COVID, so I'm just going to stay at home. That's how it should have been. But that's not what it was like. People like Chris were treated like villains for making an act of economic survival, not just for himself, but for also all of his employees too. We've got one more clip from Chris's incredible testimony before the NCI. He did get a little emotional, especially when he was talking about Staff Sergeant Bruce Holliday, who was transferred out of Bashaw to Stettler, and he took his life earlier in the year. But everybody knew Bruce was a good guy in a bad situation. But anyway, let's hear this next clip from Chris.
My friend Carrie over there and I, we of all the things that could have happened to a guy that owns the Whistle Stop Café, we got hit by a train. Can you believe that? We got hit by a train. And on social media, the outpouring of concern was amazing. Like, it was just, people were legitimately concerned for us and asking all the time how we're doing. But there were some people that said things like, I was so happy when I heard that. It's such a shame that the you two freedomers didn't die. And that hit me like a freight train. That the idea that in this country where we're supposed to be free to disagree on certain issues and our leadership is supposed to foster good relations between us, right? They're not supposed to divide us with fear. That we've come to a point where one side actually wants the other side to die because they don't have the same opinions. And it's no different in my town.
Yeah, and you know what? The people espousing that opinion, Sheila, tend to be from the love trumps hate community. Fancy that, eh?
Yeah, there was one more clip, but we don't have time to show it, where Chris talks about how much differently he was treated in the independent media versus the Trudeau colonized, subsidized media. And how, not just him, but how anybody who held, even, as he says, just a different opinion, how they were treated by the mainstream media. We don't necessarily have to show it, but you can find it on our social media pages, particularly on Twitter, because it seems to be the less censorious one. That's a clip from something we call Rebel News Daily. It's our daily live stream hosted by my friend David Menzies, but the show also includes a rotating cast of hosts and special guests, including me. It's a great way for us to talk about the news of the day as the news is happening in an unscripted fashion, and it's an awesome way for you to interact with us as well. We stream every weekday, 1 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Mountain, wherever you find Rebel News. See you there.